Okay, good evening, everyone. Today we are hosting our first policy subcommittee meeting live streamed because of the pandemic. So, Mr. Aho, if you could please do the roll.
This is DeFabio.
Here.
This is Gordon.
Here.
All right, thank you. So good evening, Mrs. DeFabio and Mrs. Gordon. Generally speaking, when we do these meetings, what happens is that we invite the administrators who have oversight of these policies to provide insight as to the recommendations for the revisions to the policies. We get the initial revisions or suggestions for revisions from Neola, which is an agency that we work with that stays close to policy as it is suggested through the Ohio Revised Code. And then we take a look at what our current policies are. We look at the recommendations. This works through a process amongst the administrative team. And then we get to the point to ask for your consideration to look at the suggested revisions and then hopeful approval for tonight's part of this. And then it would go to the Board of Education as the fuller board for further consideration and hopeful approval. So this evening, we will start with the policy, which is 2431, interscholastic athletics. And as our athletics director, Mr. Fantone has oversight to that. And so, Brian, if you could just talk the board members through what the recommendations are for revisions to that policy. You're still muted, Brian.
Sorry about that. Hi, everybody. So I will just kind of start at the top here at the overview in regards to interscholastic athletics in our school district. A few additions that were made to this. The board believes that it is important to maintain athletic and co-curricular activities programs sufficiently varied to meet the wide range of vocational, recreational, social, and cultural needs and interests of the students is going to be an addition on the overview page here, as well as an explanation of any new sports team that our school district would adopt, and the fact that a new sports team in a building has to essentially start as a club sport for 2 consecutive years prior to receiving consideration by the Board of Education as an actual school-sponsored interscholastic sport. An expansion of a current athletic program is not considered a creation of a new sports team. So an example of that would be if we ever were at a point where, let's say, soccer would go on at the middle school, that would be an expansion of a current athletic program that we already have here in the district, as opposed to bringing an entirely new sport into the district. So moving down here into the eligibility requirements, obviously as a member school of the Ohio High School Athletic Association, all of our student athletes have to be eligible to participate in that extracurricular activity. And the requirements for that would be a 1.25 grade point average in the previous grading period, the previous 9 weeks, as well as passing 5 full credits during the marking period or grading period directly preceding the athlete's participation in a sport. And there's a adjustment made down below also talking about the 5 credits with a 1.25 GPA. Moving down through the document, our next revision is the addition of the submission of payment for pay to participate fees by the required due date as a part of the responsibility of the student athlete and their family to participate in interscholastic athletics. We also are including here under the superintendent section that schedule of events would be posted, for example, on our school district website calendar as they are available and as they are adjusted for a variety of different reasons.
I have a couple questions.
Yeah.
Pay to pay, play to pay, participate. Are we going to do something about these fees this year? As far as like a reduction? Or,
So, Mrs. DeFabio, that's the conversation that is to be had at the work session that we're trying to get scheduled.
okay.
So that's absolutely a separate conversation away from policy.
Okay.
And the language that Mr. Fantone has talked through this evening, for the most part, those practices are already in place. That talks about submitting the fee by the required dates, but really what we should look at is page 3, the restoration of an incomplete grade. That's where that's the new language, starting at the top of restoration of an incomplete grade, and how the district would afford a student an opportunity to write a situation where he or she may have had an experience for which they received an incomplete grade, and then that grade is changed to a passing letter grade. There's a lot that goes on behind the scenes with regard to eligibility and making sure, especially kids transferring in and out of the school district. And Brian spends a lot of time with that, calculating grades, and this whole idea of incomplete has become an issue not just for Twinsburg schools, but high schools across the state. And how does that work in with the GPA eligibility, not just for OHSAA, but it also has impact to the NCAA requirements. And we've learned a lot about that during this pandemic. So in that respect, that's the big deal here on this policy revision, would be the restoration of an incomplete grade, because the current policy does not even have that language in there. And now that would provide our kids with an opportunity to be able to right that ship if they were getting into a circumstance for which the teacher had assigned the incomplete grade. And then it was changed to passing, and then how that would be calculated into eligibility for athletics.
My other issue is the low GPA for eligibility. I still just don't understand the low standards. I mean, that's saying that a student can have 40s and a C in order to play. And my problem is,
I agree. I feel like the 1.25 is low. I'm not sure how it's decided.
So it was several years ago, and Brian, you could address this as well. The Board of Education, it was at the point that we were concerned about providing intervention for kids, and it was initially intervention for students who were athletes. It became a bigger issue, and out of that actually came the development of our academic coaching program at the high school and the middle school. But it was through the conversations with coaches and teachers and administrators that the 1.25 was actually the number that the Board of Education landed on. It wasn't that very many years ago. Brian, can you offer some insight into that? Because you were hugely involved in that conversation.
Yeah, so I think it was about, I'm just going to guess it was about 6 years ago. I was still at the middle school at the time when we had the conversation. And I think there were some concerns similar to these where that 1.25 GPA was too low. And so we brought in a whole variety of people into the conversation. I can remember a coaches meeting in the LGI room one evening with high school and middle school coaches and different people involved in that, as well as I think it morphed into not just with athletics, but with everything. And one of the concerns that was raised was if we increase that GPA number, what that would do to our kids who are dependent on those extracurricular activities in those after school hours. If we were just essentially going to say, you're no longer a part of this activity, what would the bounce back be for that kid? You know, would it have a positive effect? Would it motivate them, or would it just send them in the other direction into a complete spiral? So I know that there are a lot of different opinions that went back and forth. Very strong opinions to raise it and very strong opinions to keep it the same. And I do remember that at the time, and I don't remember which board members were on that committee at the time, but they did decide on, we're going to stay put with the 1.25 GPA for our school district. And I
So
think it's,
Kathy, at a 1.25, are they automatically assigned to an academic coach anyway?
Well, if your GPA is that level, then there would have been a lot of conversation amongst the teaching staff to provide support to the students, because as you indicated, those grades aren't that great and aren't strong, and so it became a huge talking point as to what we provide, because before the academic coaches, we were relying on the athletic coaches to do study tables after school. And first of all, a lot of those ladies and gentlemen weren't even members of our teaching staff. They weren't certificated, and they were hired to do the athletic part of it, not to do the teaching part. And so we were grateful to have an opportunity to grow this academic coaching program. And it all started because of the conversation around the GPAs with the athletic kids. That's how the whole thing started. And it was also the work of the board's student activities committee. They convened a pretty big group of coaching staff members, teachers, administrators, and they landed on this 1.25 as the consensus amongst all those people that were part of that conversation.
So now we have a different support system, it sounds like. So is there a possibility that we could potentially up the standard, right? The goals for the kids with a clause that they'll get support. And I don't know what that standard, like if there's a time based on it, but that they have to participate in academic coaching. So it becomes a carrot, right? For them to be able to go back and play, but then there's some expectations put around it.
Well, we, these things are fluid. And so if it is the desire of the board to study the GPA, what I would suggest is that we would revisit, as we did when this whole thing started 5 or 6 years ago, and that is making sure we're pulling in the teachers and the coaching staff and the administrators to that conversation, because they bring a perspective that is different than mine and yours, and it's really valuable to have everybody sitting at the table to have that conversation. So
Yeah,
we can certainly do that. And, that would be the work of the Student Activities Committee. That is how it was pushed forward the last time. So if that's a recommendation, we surely can, as soon as we can get through this month of May, maybe take a look at it in the early part of the summer.
Sounds like a plan.
Yeah, do you agree, Angela?
I do.
For me, this was one of the few policies I had that question on. I mean, I paused a little bit at that. And the other thing that we might want to discuss, at least from my perspective, is on the pay to play. I think we're going to have more families not be able to do that this year to meet those time commitments. And so I was curious if there's like an appeal process or something on the pay to play part.
So pay to participate is actually had lots of conversation too, and our families who are free and or reduced families, as far as eligibility for the federal meal program, are provided either a waiver of athletic fees or a significant reduction in that. And that's one of the reasons why we wanted to have that board work session to visit that with the 5 board members and ask for some direction. We have recommendations for all fees for next year, but clearly I think this is a time in our school district's history that we should probably take a look at the whole shebang of that and have an opportunity for your opinions to be heard and maybe make some adjustments before it goes before the board for approval. At a board meeting, there's really not enough time or opportunity to have those deep conversations. And if you need us to pull additional information, the time between a work session and a board meeting would allow us to do that.
Yeah, that feels good.
Yep.
Okay.
Sorry, Brian, if we don't finish this off, but
oh no, you're okay. You're fine.
I think this particular policy, I think having the additional meetings makes sense.
Yes.
Okay, so am I hearing that you would like us to pull 2431 then for right now?
Yes.
Okay. Anything else from Mr. Fantone tonight that you need from him? Nope.
I don't think so.
Brian, you're welcome to stay, but I think you have 3 kids that would probably like to see their dad.
Yeah, and I'm going to be here nice and early tomorrow passing out caps and gowns, so I'm going to go see my kids.
There you go.
All
Thanks,
right.
Brian.
Thank you, guys. Yep. All right.
Bye.
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 Okay, board, if we could then go to 8,500, which is the last pack of policies. It's under the umbrella of Mark Bindis and Food Services. And I have to say, it seems every time we do policy revisions, there's some kind of tweaked. Mark, you're here every meeting.
Hi, thanks. Good evening, everyone.
Thanks for joining us, Mark.
No problem. So it looks like most of our tweaks for 8,500 are going to be wordsmithing more than anything.
Yeah, I read through it.
So
Nothing surprising on there, yeah.
I think 90% of the corrections are changing from lunch to meals because we're a breakfast and lunch program now. I'll kind of leaf through real quick, see if there was anything else that stood out. A lot of the corrections had been made. Several of them were just changing the title of my position, which is food service supervisor / district dietitian. So more wordsmithing. Just want to see. Everything else seems to be, it's all mostly changing from lunches to meals. Is there anything else that you saw on there, Kathy, that we need to address?
They just changed the title from the National Lunch School Program to the Healthy Hunger Free Kids Act. And that's just more legalese. I think they just want to be inclusive of making sure that your program is known for both parts of the federal law.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm good with it. Angela, you're on mute.
Sorry. So yeah, I'm good with it too.
Okay. Thanks, Mark. Thanks for sticking around tonight.
Sure. No problem.
We'll see you soon, I'm sure.
Everyone have a good evening.
You too. Okay, so we'll go back to the top of the agenda then, and I thank you for letting the two administrators leave tonight. First is some language, and this talks about Marty's contract and the non-employment of a treasurer. And the last set of policies actually included language about my contract and the non-renewal of the superintendent, and it has to do with making sure that we keep our licensure current. And so that's the revision that I see, and that there's a piece on Marty's too that talks about insurance coverage, a surety bond. Marty, can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Originally, and this goes way back, anybody that handled money had to have a surety bond, and over time, that's evolved into having under the district's umbrella liability insurance. So over time, actually board members and superintendents and like secretaries would have to have a surety bond, but that's kind of gone by the wayside. Now it's just the treasurer that has had the surety bond, and now they're getting rid of that also. So
it's like an E&O kind of thing that's covered under insurance now, the liability insurance?
Everything's going to be under liability insurance.
But there's a specific clause in it.
Pardon me?
Is there a specific clause that says if there's some fiscal error and omission?
Yeah, it'll be in the policy. Yeah.
Okay.
It covers everybody now instead of just like right now it says, I think the board members and superintendent and business manager are covered under the insurance policy. Then you just have to include me too then.
Okay. I'm good.
Okay, so that's 1310. Any questions, Angela? Are you good?
Yeah, I'm good. I have no questions.
Okay, and then 1340 is actually, I misspoke. 1340 is the piece that talks about Marty's requirement to hold a license. Marty, can you talk a little bit about that? 1340.
Sure, and that's obviously you can't do the job if you don't have the license. Just like anybody in a school district. So that's basically same as a teacher. They can't really teach unless they have some type of license, whether it be a regular license or a temporary license. They have to have some kind of licensure. That same goes with me right there, and that's kind of where they spell it out.
Yep. Good.
Okay. So that's 1340. Thank you, Marty.
You're welcome.
The next policy is 1615. And if I could just point out something, 1615 is the use of tobacco by administrators. You'll see that sometimes that these policies are repetitive depending on the classification of employee. So it's pretty much the same language is in 1615 as it is in 3215 and 4215. So I didn't know if you want Tim to cover all three at once or take them one at a time.
Yeah, all three at once is fine. And
Yeah.
I just had one question on these, so I don't know if Tim wants to take some time to talk about it though.
Okay, Tim. I think you're on mute or something.
All right. Yeah. Can you start off by asking your question? That might help guide me a little bit.
Yeah, I mean the only question I had on this is the board building considered one of the school grounds? Because the only one that was not checked that I just was curious about was the on or off board premises.
The Board of Education is considered school grounds. Yes.
Yeah, so I just don't know what they were implying by on or off board premises at Neola. I thought that was a strange.
So I think they do policies, not necessarily because some companies want their employees to have zero contact with tobacco at all. So I know a lot of healthcare professionals may have that. So I think that was just explaining that if that was checked, we're saying that none of our employees should be having contact with tobacco in any way, shape, or form, whether it's on board property or whether it's on their personal property.
Understood.
All
okay,
right?
I'm good with those then. Yeah.
Okay. So what you will notice is that the tobacco policy or policy 1615 for administrators, we didn't have one for administrators previously. That we have actually aligned it. It will be the same for the professional staff, the classified staff. The one major change that you would see is that it begins to talk about advertise, like that was a new check for advertising. And so one of the things that has come up, I'm sorry, I want to read it. So when we're talking about advertising and promotion, essentially it's explaining that tobacco advertising is prohibited on school grounds in all school-sponsored publications, school-sponsored events, and tobacco promotional items that promote the use of tobacco products, including clothing, bags, lighters, other personal articles are not permitted on school grounds, in school vehicles, or on school or at school-sponsored events. So this is just saying that we shouldn't have a teacher show up with the Marlboro Man on a T-shirt at a football game. That would be in violation of this policy. Outside of that, I believe the policy remains intact, and that was the major change. Mrs. Powers, did I miss anything outside of that? I don't believe I did.
Well, the one addition to, and we're talking about 3215 and 4215, and actually even in 1615, although it's a new policy there, is talking about the definition of tobacco, and that it's including but not limiting to jewels and such. And you know, as this whole vaping and juuling and all that came to light, our policies have to be updated too. And so that's new language there. And hey, Tim, can you just explain to the board, it seems every year the district is, we're provided an opportunity to be reviewed with regard to our smoke-free environment. And you have to send to the ODE board policies, and they actually look to make sure that our policies are aligned to the right way of managing tobacco or the lack of tobacco on board property.
Yes, that's correct. And so we submit that yearly just to stay in line with ODE. And one of the things that we do look at is One is making sure that we are going to provide some sort of educational component. A lot of that actually, I would say, starts down with the DARE program, which they actually do. It's not just drugs, but tobacco and any sort of anything that's addicting, as well as we do submit and discuss how every year we do have to make sure that we have appropriate signage posted throughout the district, the no smoking sign. We post the safe environment signs, and essentially one of a part of that is forgive me, it's the whistleblower. So if someone makes a claim that someone's smoking on school property, whatever it may be, if staff, student, that's something that I will be investigating, or a supervisor. So we have all those things in place in order to stay current with the ODE.
Sounds good.
Okay. The next one, Jen, school choice options.
Good evening. You'll see that in this policy 5113, there's a lot of strike through. So it's gone through No Child Left Behind, then it moved into ESEA, and now they've stricken all of that. And it is school choice option is related to if it's persistently dangerous, or the student has had a violent crime on property. So that language was in the current policy as well. The only change really is that the first paragraph is stricken.
So Neola struck that?
Yes.
So something's changed in the law then. That was my question on this one. Is I thought the ESEA law was allowing school choice. So something changed in the federal law now?
I think it is because that they were having changes with the school improvement and those different types of terminology based on ESSA. And then this is actually based on ESEA, which is the Elementary and Secondary Act. Gotcha.
I see. You're right. So that was the one before ESSA. Okay. It's interesting. Because when I saw this, I thought the law must have changed. So, all right. I'm okay with it. I don't know about you, Angela.
Okay. Angela, any questions about 51-1302?
No, I'm good with it.
Thank you. So the next one, 5,200 attendance. Boy, this policy is getting a workout right now with the way we're operating as a school district. And so let's talk through this as if we're boots on the ground kids in school, because I'm sure we're going to get an update here over the summer with regard to how attendance will be managed if we're back into some kind of a blended learning environment next year.
Yeah, so we would just put it back on the schedule for next year to renew again. Is that the intent?
So what this would be if we had school as we would typically with kids in school, and there has been a lot of conversation inside the organization about what are we doing with our truant students. The courts at this point are not suggesting that we file on truancy because of the uneven playing field with how families are operating through this pandemic. So this policy would live in the realm as if we're back to normal. And what I mentioned earlier, I would expect that Neola would come forward with a revised policy for next year if in fact we're operating under this virtual learning platform. So this would be a policy the board would take a look at in approving in the short term, should we be back to normal with kids in schools. And Tim, can you just talk about the excessive attendance? Tim is the administrator that files in the courts system, and he works closely with the principals when there has to be an attendance action plan written with families when kids are struggling and coming to school. And everything was adjusted a few years ago when we went from being accountable by days to accountability by hours of school days. And so we've adjusted this policy quite frequently over the last 2 or 3 years.
So with the excessive absences, that's one of the benchmarks that if a student is absent for X amount of hours or X amount of time within a certain time frame, it goes in as excessive. One of the things that we ran into was the issue of medically fragile students or students with a legitimate excuse, whatever it may be. And so with current policy that was in place, there was no way to not track those hours. So a student who may have been medically fragile, it was still on us as a district to still count those hours, send the letter saying that the student is excessively absent, but we would send the letter, obviously, with an extra note attached saying, we understand of the situation happening. No further action is needed. One of the things that has come out this year, which will help us with this excessive absence piece, you will notice that the change from the first sentence under excessive absences, the new language will include, so currently it is when a student of compulsory school age is absent from school with or without legitimate excuse for 38 or more hours in a school month or 65 or more hours in a school year. All right. So the language that has been added includes non-medical. All right. So
what page are you looking at? Just so I'm reading the language.
Page 3.
All right. So the new language will read, when a student of compulsory school age is absent from school with a combined non-medical excused absences and unexcused absence in excess of that time frame. So just having the word non-medical in there, it gives that the leeway to students who we know have severe medical needs and so on from there. So that was a huge piece. We have the option in that drop down, I'm looking at the system right now. So we have the option to code something as a medical excuse. Obviously, it's not if a parent calls in and said, little Johnny has a cold, that's not a medical excuse. But in speaking with the principal, the counselor, if there's an ongoing medical need, and not trying to be funny, but if we use our most current situation of COVID-19, that's a severe medical need where a student has been need to be quarantined, those hours would not count against that student at that point.
Yeah, understood.
Understood.
I guess my only question on this is there a benefit of voting on this, now and then having to redo this in the fall? Because it doesn't really apply now, and redoing it. I mean, is there a possibility, should we pause on this, or I don't know. I'm kind of open to debate. I just don't know if there's a benefit in doing this right now. Is it affecting anybody?
It doesn't affect anybody immediately. However, we do have some students that Tim has filed on this year. And so it actually catches up with where we should have been. And I don't know where the courts are with those couple of kids that you filed on right before the school closure happened. Everything kind of took a pause because things are closed down. But my recommendation is to approve this because honestly, the language that Tim shared with you is actually is it House Bill 410 language, Tim?
Yes.
So we don't really have a choice in the matter. The board has to align to House Bill 410's requirements. So this catches up with that. So at least when we're back in session, or if the courts were to determine next year that students, even if they're learning virtually, have to be accounted for as far as attendance goes, then we have a policy to back that up. So that's the importance of doing that right now.
Okay, I guess it's fair. Yeah, I think we just need to be mindful of this because in the virtual world, it's going to be very different.
That's for sure. Okay, thank you for that. Policy 5230. It actually goes back, this policy, the only change to it is a piece, and it's talking about when a person comes to remove a student from school early, or a student comes to school late after the school day has started. The only piece that's new on this policy is on the last page. Presentation of a photo identification is required of anyone authorized, such custody. So that's good practice, and we actually already do that through our welcome centers. We don't release kids with just about anybody, but the importance of this is, say a mom were to call Wilcox on a busy day and say, my neighbor such and so is going to come and pick up my child. It just formalizes the fact that no matter who's coming to pick up children, that they have to be able to present a photo ID before the child is released to that person. And it actually will be helpful to our welcome center receptionists to have that in their back pocket, because sometimes it can be a little tense, and this will give them the authority to say, well, without a photo ID, we can't release it. And it happened at Dodge in the winter, when a parent had sent somebody to pick up a child from a transportation service, and the person didn't have a photo ID. And I happened to be there that day, and it caused a little bit of a tense situation with the person because they didn't have a photo ID to say who they were. So this adds just a layer of protection to our students by adding that to board policy. Okay. Angela, you're good with that?
I am great with that. Yep.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, the next one is student mental health and suicide prevention. And this is under Andrea's umbrella. Hi, Andrea.
Hi there, how's everybody?
Good to see you.
Good to see you too. So when I'm looking at this, essentially one of the things that we added as far as a change is if you read the policy, it talks about having mainly just our certified staff being trained, but one of the additions that we wanted to include in here is the designation of some classified staff members also being aware of some of the things that we have going on in the district, because we're recognizing the value and have always recognized the value of all staff. But in particular, for instance, in my head, I can see this being like an intervention assistant who is in the classroom, who may not be the teacher, but someone who may have contact with the student, who may also get information, who might be able to assist a child who might be in some form of distress. So that was the reason for that change.
Intervention specialist would be classified?
An assistant in the classroom. I'm just somebody.
Oh, I see.
Someone who may not be a teacher, but may have a lot of contact with our students. But so I think the language is just a little bit more clear to include our classified staff members who may hear something and may also need that training so that they're adequately prepared.
And the other part of that, the other piece that's more defined, and this actually falls under Jen's umbrella of professional development, but in this case, it talks about making sure that professional development happens for youth suicide awareness and prevention at least every 2 years. Jen, can you just let the board members know how that looks on our side of things with regard to training through public school work for our staff members?
Sure. We subscribe to Public School Works for all of our staff to take modules for training throughout the year. We have different windows where we have courses that we take. And one of the current laws is that we take a child abuse and prevention class every 5 years. So it's 5 different modules that we do every 5 years. But what Public School Works will do now is they will take that requirement from this policy and put it in a different course. So we will be able to assign it to our staff. We use Public School Works to make sure we do all of the mandated trainings that we have to do. Child abuse, homeless awareness, all of the different things that we have to do. And I'm sure there will be some new ones for COVID-19 that we'll be doing as well.
Are these steps part of a program, stabilization, assessment of risk? Is that part of the specific program, or I was just curious why it was spelled out?
So, Andrea, when you first got on board, I think the Board of Education passed a suicide prevention curriculum that was actually under the umbrella from the Ohio Department of Education that came through, I think, Jen, your Curriculum and Technology Committee. And in that curriculum, I believe those steps are defined. Isn't that correct?
The steps
That
are
is
defined,
accurate.
and also it just one of the biggest thing is that the first step is obviously to stabilize the child and then create the assessment after which the child is assessed and to move forward with trying to get them into a lower risk category so that they can be successful.
So this was Neola language that supported the curriculum?
Yes, because honestly, the requirement for the board to approve a suicide prevention curriculum came out first, and then Neola developed the board policy that supports that requirement now in law.
Okay. Thank you.
Welcome. Anything else, Andrea or Jen, about that training or that piece?
No.
Okay, thank you. 5512 is again the policy about tobacco, and this one, anything with the 5,000s would be student related. So we talked about administrators and we talked about classified staff and certificated staff, but this one is particular to our students, and I don't think there is any much difference, Tim or Andrea, but that falls under wellness and under Tim, your umbrella of tobacco-free work environment. So did you have anything else you wanted to add to that one?
I think.
Oh,
sorry. Go ahead.
I think, like I mentioned earlier, the one thing that was added is the checkbox where we're talking about the advertisement piece. I know we do have some language regarding to what students can and can't wear to school, but that advertisement piece was in there also. So once again, a student shouldn't pull in, just hypothetically, if a student is driving, a student shouldn't pull in and have a bumper sticker regarding smoking or something in its back window or something of that nature. So once again, it's all about the promoting and advertisement of tobacco.
Or the non-promotion, right?
Yes, the non.
Right. Okay. Any other questions about that policy?
Nope.
Okay. Thank you. This one goes to Chad and Marty. This talks about the disposition of real property and personal property.
Yeah. So policy 7300. Honestly, there's not much of a change. It just the biggest change is due to Ohio Revised Code 3313.41 that when you have an unused piece of property, it can only be unused for 1 year as opposed to 2 years. And that's just a reflection of Ohio Revised Code. Other than that, all the rest of the language is the same as what we've had before.
That's fine. It's probably good, actually. Right.
Yep.
Correct.
Marty, anything to add?
no, that's pretty much it. Good. Nothing based on it.
Right. All right, thank you. Tim, back to you. Boy, we have a lot of tobacco policies on this packet today. Anything different? I don't think so. You're muted, Tim.
Am I still muted?
No, you're good.
All right. There's a delay there that gets me. There's no changes in this policy for this one.
Other than what you previously had explained.
Exactly. I should have prefaced by saying that.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. Thank you. All right. So this next one actually is kind of an interesting policy. we hear a lot about those, what do you call those, Chad, those things that fly around.
The drones?
The drones, right. And a couple years ago, we actually had a lot of conversation because the Ohio High School Athletic Association came out with a guidance document to school districts that would suggest that when students are in athletic events at the stadium, or they're running cross country or whatever, that they would prohibit the use of drones flying over the heads of our kids. And so this policy is secondary to that guidance document. And I'm going to stop talking and let Chad talk a little bit about what this policy says.
Sure. Thank you. So we basically have two options in a new policy regarding drones. We're encouraging option number 2, which allows the superintendent to authorize drones, or small unmanned aircraft systems, as they're called, for certain purposes. For instance, one would be some of the roof studies that we do, or actually a traffic study as well. There's some good applications of using drones, but in a specific instance to help us understand our facilities better. And it does mention in here that you would need to have a remote pilot certificate that's issued by the FAA to ensure, and that, and anytime we've reviewed that, we do make sure that we're not able to identify anything in the drone other than big objects like the roof, for instance, or flow of traffic, stuff like that. So that's the recommendation for the policy.
So my only question, I read this differently the first time, so I'm glad. Thank you for the clarification on that. So
Sure.
I just am mindful of kids in the arts, and drones are part of the arts today. And so my only thought on that is I totally get why we don't want drones flying over the sports teams, and we also probably don't want strangers coming onto property and flying them over kids. But there might be some time in the next year we want a kid to be able to do a film. So I don't know if there's, my concern is with the clause here that they need a license. That won't happen, right? So I don't know if there's any way to get around that in language, but that would be my only caveat.
So Chad, do you know, and maybe you could look this up while we could talk through the next agenda item, if there's currently a policy about drones separate than this one? Because I thought there was a second one, because this is not the first time the board has engaged in a conversation about this. And that initial time was about the OHSAA directive about that. And we've actually had some conversation even with our cable provider who wanted to fly drones over the stadium during a football game and such. And that's really precarious in how that happens. And it captures some video of students whose parents don't want their photos captured. So it's a problem for the district. But I thought there was a secondary policy, or the board passed a resolution, or something else has happened with this drone language before.
Yeah, so I'm fairly certain it was a resolution, as opposed to, I just looked on board docs. I'm not aware of a specific policy as opposed to a resolution. I think one of the things in the airspace, theoretically, it is controlled by the FAA. Drones are, and so I think that's part of the reason for the remote pilot license. But we can certainly look into that further.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I think having a clause that allows flexibility on it is preferred. But yeah, that would be my only thing. Is at some point you're going to have kids that are going to do some filming. It's going to get more popular. So
yeah,
but
yeah.
if it's not
Good
practical,
point.
it's not practical.
I think the security of this one allows Chad to be a little bit more strategic in who he has contracts with, because we want to make sure that the roofing company and people that are doing work on the property are well licensed before we let them do whatever. So that's what I think that the gist of this particular policy is about, and falling under the 7,000s category.
Got it.
There was a board resolution, and it was 15,364. And it prohibited drones. It kind of mentions OHSAA.
Mm-hmm. When was that, Marty? It was like 4 years ago, wasn't it?
September of 2015.
Yeah. If you would like, we could talk with Neola to see if they're creating a policy regarding student use of drones. I mean, that's a good first go-to place.
Yeah, that would be great.
Okay, we can ask.
I can't believe we would be the only people to ask that question.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll follow up with them. But otherwise, 744003 is fine. Okay, thank you. Chad, school safety 8400.
Yeah, so 8400 is pretty much a reissued policy. I think the story behind this is that in January 2015, there was optional language provided by Neola in regards to the threat assessment procedures and considerations. And now there's definitely an increased focus on threat assessment teams. We actually had selected the threat assessment team procedure in previous versions of our board policy. So there really isn't too much more to this policy, because it was just having us revisit something that was optional in the past and was highly recommended now.
Yeah, the only question I had was on the choices on the last page.
Okay.
So, yeah, if you could just talk through why you chose the first box on the first statement and the second box on the second statement. Just help me understand that. Am I not on the last page? I'm on the second to last. I'm sorry.
Yeah, so you're on page 85.
I don't have a number, but the board recognizes state and federal law requires is the first paragraph.
Yeah, so you're talking about the why it's discussed this at the annual meeting, and then the convene a meeting of the building administrator. That those selections.
Yeah, those two. Yeah, I'm just trying to understand what that means.
Honestly, that's our current language in our current board policy. So that's honestly why those were selected.
And currently, a requirement of the emergency management plan is that we cannot sign off. Actually, it's required that Chris Noga and Tim Morgan sign off on the plan before it can be submitted to Columbus. And so if there's any corrective action that needs to be taken, those are conversations that naturally happen with Tim and with Chris. And also, Chad, remind me of which office at Summit County also has a hand in this. There's somebody that you have to file with down there. I cannot remember which office it is.
So it's the Summit County office, and let me look up exactly who that is.
So I guess the point is that already is happening, and the building administrators actually are largely involved in reviewing their plans, and they have to have their staff review with them. It's part of the requirements from Columbus that happens annually, and then annually we all have to certify through this online process, and we get frequent reminders when it gets close to July, and reminders that unless that we filed appropriately, that our licensure is in peril. So trust me, everybody gets their paperwork done and the review done timely and accurately.
And the
My only
exact title,
pause on
it's
this- Sorry, my
Oh,
only
sorry.
pause on this was I'm just trying to understand in language the timing. So to me, if anytime there's any kind of violent event, right, you would want to be on it immediately. You wouldn't want, so that was, and I understand that you are, but that the language in here is a little bit vague. I think this is a Neola issue on the timing elements. I don't think they really spelled that out on the immediacy of management of it. So outside of this, you have legal requirements, is what I'm hearing, outside of the policy that you just have to follow.
Yeah, pretty stringent ones, actually.
That are immediate, I would assume.
Uh-huh.
Okay. All right. Well, that was my question on this, was really about the timing element.
Would you like us to
and
add anything in addition to this to clarify that a little bit better?
Yeah, I just think it's the best practice, right? I mean, we wouldn't want to wait a year to be addressing it. And this kind of implies that we have an annual event. I would think we would want to address it faster. I don't know. What do you think, Angela?
I agree.
So, do you have a recommendation as to where you'd like us to add something here, or what the wording might be?
Is it possible to come back on that? Because I hadn't thought through that. I thought I thought that we would just have a clear explanation and I'd move on. So I didn't think through extra language. Or do you need it now? You need it now.
Well, we should talk through it now, so that this can move forward. So, would you be more comfortable if in the where we have the box mark, discuss this at the annual meeting? Do you want us to check the box underneath it where it says convene a meeting of the building administrator?
Yeah, I mean, see, that's because there's no timing element on that one either. But that's where my head was originally when I read this. Is that felt more immediate to me?
Okay, so we can do that. We can uncheck the first box, check the second box, and then how about immediately following any situation deemed persistently dangerous?
Yeah, and I don't even know if you need that language. It would, yeah. I guess it's defined up on the first. But you probably want to put a timing element on it within X amount of time, 30 days, whatever.
Within 30 days of an incident. Hey, Marty, I think you need to mute because I think that's the vacuum cleaner on that side of the building.
Marty's on mute.
I don't know what that is then.
Running the vacuum cleaner. I am on mute.
That's a drone or something. I don't know.
Communist.
I think if in regards to the language, it's really referring to at the end of each year where the number of reportable incidents of violent criminal offenses exceed a threshold number established in state policy.
So it doesn't matter on the timing. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm sorry. When I was looking at this originally, I was more focused on the changes compared to the previous. But then, like, this part is also required by statute in regards to that if you do exceed a threshold, you need to discuss it either in an annual meeting or if you're going to convene a meeting of the building administrator. But you do need to have one of those in there for to be in compliance with the law.
Got it. Okay. Thank you for first time I'm reading these. So So
No,
I
sorry, you honestly caught me off guard for a second too.
okay. So when you do the annual meeting, who is involved in that? Do you have like Chief Noga involved?
Yeah. So
Okay.
we
Well, then
have
I
an
don't think
annual.
so.
Yeah, we have an annual meeting with the chiefs, both of police and fire.
Okay, I'm okay then. I don't think we need to change it.
And sometimes the assistant chiefs accompany them. It just depends.
Okay. Thank you for putting me up to speed on that and pointing out the sentence I missed. So I appreciate that.
No,
'Cause I really had not thought that, so it helps.
Yeah, no problem at all.
Okay, the next one, 8403. The board in January actually approved a school resource officer policy. And then shortly thereafter, we got this recommendation for a very minor revision, and that's in the third paragraph, second from the bottom line, where they're suggesting that in our policy for the school resource officer, we include the wording student privacy under state and federal law. So that's the only change to the policy, and it's a pretty important one because when you talk about the fact that our school resource officers have access to a lot of student private information, through being at the main offices and having access to student files, we want to make sure that they understand the importance of student privacy through FERPA and sometimes through HIPAA, although it's more FERPA in our world. And by adding that those 5 or 6 words, it just ensures that everybody's on the same page as the expectation that they have to follow our requirements with regard to student privacy.
Got it.
Okay. Andrea, student abuse and neglect, 8462.
Just looking through what we've had, we've made some suggestions that would, I think we eliminated some things that were in that we found maybe to be a little bit redundant or in other parts of the category. For instance, some of the things that you see that are the suggested deletions have been moved and or are in other parts of the paragraphs, but this does also take into account the adoption of the Ohio Department of Education Suicide and Awareness Prevention Programming, and also just discusses very similarly to what we discussed earlier with Jen in professional development, that new employees would be trained on this as well as other employees every 2 years.
I don't even remember why I put a note on this. I'm guessing there's a separate policy on staff and abuse if that happens to happen. I'm assuming there's a separate policy on that.
Well, 8462 is the overarching student abuse policy, but all of us who have licenses are required and mandated reporters. And so honestly, this has been a pretty current conversation because now that the kids aren't in school, what we're hearing from the Summit County Department of Children and Family Services and other counties are hearing the same, is that the number of reports of child abuse and neglect have plummeted. And so as a staff here, Andrea has been communicating frequently and often with our counselors and administrators to try to make sure that we are paying attention to this kind of stuff and reporting as appropriate. So we're all mandated reporters and are required to make sure that if we have even a suspicion of abuse or neglect, that we are making the reports to either the Department of Children and Family Services or the local law enforcement authorities.
Yeah, I get that. So thank you. I guess my note that I had for myself was more around if there happens to be abuse within staff to student. And I know that, that doesn't happen often, but it does happen occasionally. So I'm assuming there's a different policy out there on that. That's my question.
So, Tim and Andrea, and I think Chad at some point, are the Board of Education's designees for investigations into harassment and bullying and those kinds of things. I think it's a 5517, Tim, that policy.
Okay.
Yes, it is 5517, bullying and other forms of aggressive behavior.
So
Okay.
it would be covered in there. It's pretty specific about concerns and the process for making complaints, either formal or informal, and then the investigation that would happen thereafter.
Okay. Yeah, that was my only question because there was no mention. This is really implying family. So
Yeah.
okay. I'm fine with it.
Okay. And that's the last of them for tonight.
Thank you.
So how we'll pull 2431 and suggest that Tina and Angela maybe pull together the Student Activities Committee to take a look at GPA. And then also the board will be engaging in the conversation about pay to participate at some point here the next couple of weeks. So that'll inform that policy. And then I'll contact Neola about the use of drones by students for student work. We'll see if there's a policy draft out there we can take a look at. So how this will work then is the policies tonight that you have authorized as moving forward, I'll have Mary Ann send them to the board per your suggestion of, I think in January, Mrs. Gordon. We won't put these on the agenda for the next meeting. We'll give the board the extra 2 weeks. So these will go on the May 20th agenda for the first reading, if that's what you like us to do.
I think that makes sense.
Okay. All right. So that's how we'll proceed. And any other questions for tonight?
No.
Kimar, do you want to take the roll?
Sure. 7-Eleven.
Sounds like a restaurant or something.
Yeah. Mrs. DeFabio.
Yes.
Mrs. Gordon.
Yes.
We're adjourned.
Thank
All
you,
right.
everyone.